you are a beginner and you struggle in the opening. Let's say you play the first 5-10 moves and you get destroyed, so you can't really survive the opening, and you're trying to find what is the best opening for white and for black. Now, I'm sorry to let you know that there isn't a best opening for white and for black. There are a lot of openings that are playable, and you should play the opening that suit your style the most. Obviously, your style right now is blundering the queen at move 4, so it's not that simple, but what can I say is that certainly I can teach you an opening, or it's better to say a setup, that in my opinion is the best for beginners. In this video I'm going to show you the setup for white, in the next video I'm going to show you the setup for black, so it's time to start. Even if you are a beginner, you might know that the two most played moves and best moves are d4 or e4. Now, it's true that both of them are completely fine, so you can play e4 or d4, but if you are a beginner, forgot about d4, forgot about it, and I'll tell you why. e4 follows chess principles much more than d4. First of all, what are chess principles? Well, there are many principles, but I would say that the most important are 5. The first one is develop minor pieces before the major pieces. If you don't know what a minor piece is, minor pieces are the knight and the bishop. Major pieces are the rook and the queen. The king is a piece apart. So the first thing you need to understand is that you want to develop, so you want to use the knight and the bishop. The second principle is that you shouldn't move the same piece 2 or more times in the opening. So for example, let's say we play knight on f3 and the play is something like this, we shouldn't move the knight again. Why? Because we are just wasting times. In the meanwhile, our opponent can gain some tempo, can develop his pieces, and we are just helping him. The third principle is that you should castle as soon as possible. In order to castle, you need to move all the pieces that are between the king and the rook. So we need to develop the bishop and the knight first. The fourth principle is that you shouldn't move the queen in the opening, because otherwise it becomes a target. Let's say in the Scandinavian, for example, we play something like this, and that's the main line, but the queen is under attack, you are a beginner, you don't know what to do, and you're going to lose the queen in the next 2 moves probably. And the last really important thing you need to know is that you should take space in the center. How do you take space in the center? By the way, the center is this. You should move the pawn, so that's why you play e4 or d4. Now, why is e4 better than d4 for a beginner? Well, it's because, let's say you play d4, and we play the London, which is the opening that everyone suggests for beginners. We develop this bishop, first of all. This bishop has nothing to do with the king side, so you're not going to castle as soon as possible. Now, let's say our opponent plays a normal move, which is knight f6, the most played move. Now you play e3, which makes sense, but we're not really taking a lot of space. This is in order to open the line for the bishop, but our opponent can play c5, which is again the most played move, and you need to know that you have to play c3. Now, are you developing pieces? Not. You're just moving pawns. You don't even know why. And the risk doing this is that you don't understand how to develop pieces. You don't castle, so you don't understand how to actually play chess. What I'm trying to teach you today is not the best opening in the world. It's how to play chess. I'm trying to teach you what you should play in order to understand how pieces should be developed and how chess is supposed to be played. So going back, that's why you shouldn't play d4, but you should play e4, and I'm going to show you some lines. First of all, after e4, 90% of the time people are going to reply with d5, at least at beginner's level, because you're just copying your opponent, so it's a pretty simple move. And now we develop the knight. Why? Because we have to develop minor pieces. The knight is a minor piece and we can develop it. Why the knight before the bishop? Well, in this case, we are attacking a pawn, so usually our opponent has to be careful and is supposed to defend it. Let's say he plays a random move, we can just take the pawn and we will be up a pawn. Let's say they play queen on e7, we can play d4 and life is good. So usually they defend it. And you are supposed to defend the pawn with the knight. Why? Because moving the knight, you defend the pawn with a minor piece, so you are developing a minor piece, which is a really good thing. At this point, as I said, we want to develop minor pieces and castle as soon as possible, so the only piece that is between the king and the rook is the bishop, so we can develop it. You can develop it on b5 or on c4 usually. I suggest you c4, because the red bets off knight g5. So the pawn on f7 is pretty weak, and at a beginner level, if you play knight g5, you basically win. So playing bishop on c4 is a pretty logical move, and that's why you should play e4, because we're just playing really logical moves. We're just developing pieces, we're just castling, and after you have developed your pieces and you have castled, you can't lose. I mean, you can lose in the future, but you can't lose in 2 moves. Now, your opponent can develop the knight or the bishop. Let's say he develops the bishop. You just castle. At this point, he wants to do the same, so develop minor pieces. He develops the knight, attacking your pawn. What you want to do? Obviously, you want to develop minor pieces. That's just the only thing you need to think about in the opening is, how can I develop a minor piece? That's the most important thing. So, we develop the knight, as you can see, defending the pawn. Now the castle. And the last piece we need to bring into the game, the last minor piece, is the dark-square bishop. And since he can't really jump over pieces as a knight, you can play d3. Why? Because first of all, it supports this pawn even more. And also you open the diagonal for the bishop. So your opponent, let's say, does the same. You can play bishop on g5. And now, as you can see, we developed everything. The last thing we need to do is moving the queen on d2 or on e2 in order to connect rooks. So rooks see each other and we are in the middle game and we can play. We survive the opening. We are in a really good shape. If you're wondering what happens now, if instead of playing bishop on c5, your opponent plays knight on f6, for example, well, the pawn is under attack. We can develop a piece defending it. And we basically transpose into the same position, as you can see, so no problem. Going back, it's true that the most played move is knight on c6, but your opponent could still play, for example, d6 or knight on f6. Now, if they play d6, defending, again, you can just follow the setup, and that's really important because you can follow the setup against most of the openings. So we play bishop on c4, so we develop the minor piece in order to castle as soon as possible. Let's say they develop the knight, which is logical. Attacking this pawn, we can defend it, developing a minor piece. They keep developing, we castle, the castle. We need to develop the dark-square bishop, so again we can play d3, develop the bishop, no problems. If they play knight on f6, what happens is that this pawn is under attack, and this pawn is under attack too. This could be tricky, so my suggestion is to not take this pawn and keep developing pieces. This pawn is under attack, so remember, whenever this pawn is under attack, you can defend it, developing a piece, so knight on c3. Remember that you shouldn't play bishop on d3. Why? Because this bishop now is basically a pawn. Imagine that instead of a bishop, you have played d3. The d3 pawn does the exact same thing of this bishop. This bishop can be used in a much better way, developing it on c4, because at least, as you can see, he sees more square. That's why instead of playing bishop on d3, we can play knight on c3. Now our opponent has to develop, so let's say he develops the bishop in order to castle as soon as possible. We can do the same. They castle, we can castle. They want to develop, we want to develop too. We play d3 in order to develop the bishop and life is good. Absolutely no problem. Although, what happens if after e4 our opponent doesn't play e5? And I'm going to show you that this setup is playable in most of the situation. Let's say they play c5, which is the most played move. So let's say 99% of the time they play c5 or they play e5. Okay, so they play e5, and again we want to develop minor pieces, so we play knight on f3. Develop the knight first, because if you develop the bishop first, it could be a target pretty soon. So you want to basically use this move in order to see what your opponent wants to do, and after that you decide where to bring the bishop. Let's say they develop the knight, playing logically. Again, we can play bishop on c4, we are following the same setup. They can play e6, we can castle, and they can develop or play d5 for example, and if you're scared about d5, don't worry, like we can just take, pawn take, and we can give a check or play bishop on b5, but we're following the same setup. After that we can move this pawn in order to develop the bishop, and then we can develop the knight on c3 or on d2. So the most important thing you need to understand is not that in a certain position you should play a certain move, is that in every position you have to develop minor pieces and castle as soon as possible. As a beginner, that's the only thing you need to understand. Now, I'm not talking too much about taking space, because the most important thing now is absolutely developing minor pieces, is not taking space. Okay, you can move every pawn you have, so you have space, but then you lose after 2 moves because your king is unsafe and because you don't have active pieces and you get destroyed. So the most important thing is just developing and castle as soon as possible. What happens if they play the French? So they play e6. Again, we can still play knight on f3. They play d5, which is the point of playing e6. We can just take. And why we take? Because if we push, we create some problem. We want to keep things simple, really simple, so we can just trade. We can take the pawn. Now, if they take with the queen, they just help us. They give us some times in order to develop pieces, so obviously that's not the best move ever. You should take with the pawn, and after that, again, we can develop the bishop, but first of all, usually you want to move the pawn before moving the bishop, because otherwise the bishop just blocks everything. Imagine you have a bishop on d3, you can't move this pawn, so this bishop is trapped, basically. So before doing that, you want to play d4, and after that they develop pieces, and we do the same. We castle, they castle. As you can see now, we can develop the bishop, so we can do that, or instead of doing that, we can play knight on c3. The best thing would be just to develop the bishop, then knight on d2, and we play c3 because it's really solid. What if they play the Caro Kann instead? Well, again, we can play knight on f3. They play d5, which is the point of playing the Caro Kann. You play this in order to support this push. Again, we can take. They should take with the pawn. We can move this pawn, and it's basically the same thing as the French. The only thing is that this time they have an e pawn, but they don't have the c pawn. And at this point they can develop. So let's say they play knight on f6. We play bishop on d3. They can play bishop on g4, or let's say they want to castle as soon as possible. Let's say they play e6. We can castle. They develop the bishop. Again, we can play bishop on g5, knight on d2, c3, rook on e1. That's the plan, is really solid and you have zero problems. And last but not least, what if they play the peers? So I'm showing you pretty much all the playable openings, so you have zero problems. These are the most played defenses. Obviously your opponent can play something else, but I'm showing you the best moves for black, and they should cover hopefully most of your games. So they play this. Again, we can play knight on f3, but as you can see, we can basically follow this setup every time. And let's say they develop the knight, attacking the pawn. Remember, every time the pawn is under attack, knight on c3, defending it. And after that, they play g6 in order to flank it to the bishop. Bishop on c4, remember that is the setup that we want to have. They flank it to the bishop, we can castle. Zero problems. They can play c5, they can play e5, they can develop the knight, they can castle, let's say. Everything they do, we just want to develop. So d3, remember, you just play d3. You could play d4, but it's more complicated, so I would suggest to play d3, and then you develop the bishop, you move the queen, rooks are connected, and life is good. And that's it for today, guys. And yes, I have another shirt because I'm Luca from the future, because I might have forgotten to make an outro. Just feel free to comment if you have something to say or something to ask. See you soon with the next video about the best defense for black.